Some mysteries vanish, not into the night, but into iron and steam. It begins with a wealthy Scottish magnate who boards the Glasgow Express, only for his locked compartment to be found empty when the train halts. From a widow's trembling grief to a solicitor's polished lies, Holmes must untangle soot, silence, and human deceit to uncover the truth. Where are you tuning in from and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let us step aboard the midnight carriage and follow the case where it leads. It was upon a grey autumn morning that I found myself once more seated in our familiar lodgings in Baker Street, watching my friend and companion pace restlessly to and fro before the hearth. The season had touched London with that peculiar melancholy which seems to hang over its streets when the leaves fall in the parks and the fog lies heavy upon the river. Holmes was in one of those moods of suppressed activity which often preceded some fresh intellectual pursuit. His long fingers drummed upon the mantelpiece, his eyes darted restlessly to the window, and more than once he flung himself into his chair, only to leap up again with renewed impatience. I had seen him in such humours before, when the absence of a stimulating problem threatened to weigh upon his extraordinary faculties. It was in the midst of this unsettled morning that a sharp knock resounded at our door, followed by the brisk step of the landlady bearing a letter in her hand. She handed it to Holmes with the information that it had been delivered by express. Holmes tore open the envelope with a swift motion, and I observed at once that his countenance assumed that peculiar brightness which only the prospect of an intricate puzzle could bring to his features. He handed me the letter after a rapid glance, and I read with astonishment an account of a most singular occurrence upon the Glasgow Express, which had reached the public ear in fragmentary form. A man of considerable importance, travelling alone in a locked compartment, had contrived to vanish utterly before the train reached its destination. The door had been found bolted from within, and yet not, but feel a chill at the thought of what grim fate might have overtaken him between London and Glasgow. Holmes, for his part, had settled into his chair with the letter spread across his knees. He read the details aloud in his even voice, pausing here and there to tap his long forefinger against a sentence which seemed to interest him particularly. "Observe, Watson," said he. "The guard testifies that the door was found fastened from within, and yet the compartment was empty. The windows were closed, and no sign of violence was present. A vanished man and a bolted door. That is the essence of our problem." He sat for a long moment in silence, his keen eyes narrowing as if to pierce the very paper. It is the locked room problem transported to the railway line. Intriguing, is it not? The city itself was already alive with speculation. The morning papers carried long columns upon the affair, their headlines bristling with exclamation marks and conjectures. Street vendors called the news aloud at every corner, and crowds gathered where broadsheets were pasted up. Some hinted at foul play, others at sudden flight from financial ruin. More fanciful writers invoked plots of foreign espionage or supernatural disappearance. I confess that the fever of excitement took hold of me also, for the riddle seemed to contain every element that could fascinate the public mind. Holmes, however, regarded the clamour with a half-smile, as one who listens to the buzzing of flies while intent upon the hidden mechanism of a watch. At length he folded the letter carefully and placed it upon the mantel. "Watson," said he, with that quiet decisiveness which admitted of no dispute, "this is the very problem for which my brain has been hungering. Here we have a man of consequence, a bolted door, and a disappearance upon a moving train. All the ingredients of a case most worthy of examination. The police will bungle it with their usual unimaginative routine. It is for The morning after Holmes had resolved to take the Glasgow affair in hand, we found ourselves driving through the quieter streets of Kensington, where the Mackinnon residence was situated. The house, a sombre edifice of darkened brick and narrow windows, stood with an air of austere reserve, as though it, too, bore the shadow of loss. Its blinds were partly drawn, and a subdued hush hung about it, which seemed to silence even the rumble of passing wheels. I could not help but feel a sympathetic pang for the young widow who dwelt within, and as we mounted the steps, I remarked to Holmes upon the melancholy aspect of the place. He, however, gave no answer, his gaze fixed keenly upon the doorway, as if it were but another problem to be solved. We were received in a quiet drawing-room by Mrs. Clara Mackinnon herself, a slender figure clad in mourning black, whose countenance, though pale and drawn, bore still the traces of youthful beauty. Her movements were deliberate, her voice low, and there was a trembling about her hands that spoke of recent tears. She welcomed us with a dignity which sat strangely upon one so evidently stricken. And when she spoke of her husband, her eyes filled with that vague, distant sorrow I have seen upon many a bereaved countenance. I confess that her air of subdued grief stirred my sympathy, and I felt inclined to reproach Holmes for the almost cold scrutiny with which he observed her every gesture. In halting tones, she explained that Sir Alister had departed from the house 2 evenings before, intending to travel to Glasgow for the conclusion of certain pressing affairs. He had spoken of negotiations which required his personal presence, though he had offered no detail as to their nature. She had seen him to his carriage, noted his air of fatigue, and bade him farewell with no suspicion that it was to be their last meeting. He was much occupied of late, she said, and though at times stern, he was not unkind to me. I cannot imagine who was much moved by the widow's evident distress. Her hands trembled as she clasped them upon her lap. Her voice broke once or twice, and more than once she turned aside to brush away a tear. There was about her an air of one crushed between grief and helplessness, and I found myself inwardly protesting at Holmes's relentless gaze, which seemed to deny the sincerity of her emotions. Surely, I thought, here was a woman who had lost her husband under the most dreadful of circumstances, and whose sorrow could not be feigned. When at last we took our leave, she rose with a weariness that bespoke genuine suffering, and murmured some words of gratitude for our interest in her plight. As we passed down the steps into the street, I could not contain my feelings. "Surely, Holmes," I exclaimed, "this poor lady has suffered enough without our adding to her burden. I cannot doubt the truth of her grief." Holmes, however, adjusted his gloves with the calm precision that marked his habits. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, "grief and misdirection are not mutually exclusive. I do not question the genuineness of her tears, but beneath them runs a current that must be traced to its source. We have seen more than she intended to reveal, and it would be folly to accept her account without further proof." With that he hailed a passing hansom, and we were soon rattling back towards Baker Street, my mind torn between pity for the widow and curiosity as to what hidden threads Holmes had already begun to unravel. By the following afternoon, Holmes had arranged for us to attend at Euston Station, where the Glasgow Express stood shunted upon a siding, its long carriages looming against the grey canopy of smoke and iron. There is to me always something impressive in the sight of a great train at rest, its energy momentarily chained, the vast pistons silent, as though it brooded upon its own power. That morning, however, the scene was touched with a peculiar gravity. A cluster of railway officials stood in consultation near the platform, their faces serious, and beyond them loomed the sombre carriage in which Sir Alister Mackinnon had last been seen alive. Holmes strode ahead with his long, nervous steps, his head bent slightly forward, as though he scented a trail invisible to the rest of us. I followed, conscious of the curious glances cast in our direction by porters and passengers alike, for the affair had stirred much excitement in the city, and every rumour seemed to magnify its mystery. Holmes exchanged a few words with the superintendent of the line, who at once placed the resources of the company at his disposal, and in a moment we found ourselves before the compartment in question. I felt an involuntary thrill as I saw the heavy door, its brass fittings dull in the afternoon light, knowing that behind it some dark fate had overtaken a man in the very midst of his journey. We were met by a railway guard, a weather-beaten fellow with an air of honest perplexity. "It's beyond my comprehension, gentlemen," said he, shaking his head. "I've been 20 years upon the line and never known the like." Sir Alister took his place at Euston, alone in this very compartment. When we reached Crewe, I passed along the train and tried the handle, but the bolt was drawn within. I thought nothing of it, for many a gentleman likes his privacy. Yet when at last we came to Glasgow, we found the same. Door fastened, blinds half drawn. We forced our way in, expecting perhaps illness or sleep, by violence from without. And yet, when they entered, there was no sign of such violence. The mechanism had been moved only in the ordinary manner. Thus we must account for an occupant who vanishes, leaving behind a locked portal and an undisturbed frame. A puzzle indeed. He straightened, his eyes bright with that peculiar inward fire I had come to know. "We stand, my dear fellow, at the threshold of one of those enigmas in which simplicity and impossibility walk hand in hand. The question before us is not merely how Sir Alister left, but why such pains were taken to cloak the manner of his departure." Holmes bent over the small tray fixed beneath the window and lifted from it the remnant of a cigar, its ash long since cold. He held it delicately between thumb and forefinger, examining the ring and the quality of the leaf. "An uncommon brand, Watson," said he, turning it so that the light revealed a faint, gilt band. "Not the sort one purchases casually from a station vendor. This is a Havana of the finer kind, retailed by only a handful of establishments in London. Sir Alister was known to favour the weed, was he not? Yet mark how little of it has been consumed. Our traveller lit it, drew perhaps 2 or 3 breaths, and then abandoned it altogether. Either some sudden interruption compelled him, or he found his attention more urgently engaged. He replaced it thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing with that look of inward calculation, which so often heralded some hidden deduction. While Holmes's gaze roved still about the compartment, it was my fortune to notice a small scrap of paper protruding from beneath the seat. Stooping, I drew it forth, and found it to be a fragment torn from a railway timetable. At first sight it seemed of no particular moment, but Holmes seized it with an eagerness that belied its modest appearance. "Excellent, Watson," he exclaimed. "See here. Observe how the tear is not the casual rent of accident, but a deliberate excision. The portion wanting is precisely that which should have contained the times of the intermediate stations. Some hand, anxious to conceal or alter the record of the train's passage, has destroyed the evidence. Why? Because the timetable, that most innocent of documents, becomes in such a case the deadliest of witnesses. It will tell us, when rightly read, not only when the train passed, but what opportunity was afforded for any act of removal." He folded the scrap with care and placed it in his pocket-book, as though it were of equal value to a banknote. Holmes's restless fingers now strayed to the sill of the window. He drew them lightly across its surface, then held them up for my inspection. "Soot, Watson," he remarked. "Just the merest trace, but enough for our purpose. Consider, this window had been shut when the guard forced the door, yet upon the sill lies the mark of recent disturbance. If a man were to be thrust through such an aperture, whilst the train thundered through a tunnel, the darkness and the smoke would veil the deed from the eyes of others. A perilous expedient, but not impossible. Observe, too, the scratches upon the frame, slight but perceptible. They speak of haste, perhaps even of violence. Sir Alister's exit, voluntary or otherwise, may not have been by the door at all, but by this narrower and more terrible way. I confessed that the thought chilled me, and I glanced involuntarily down the dark platform, as though the shadows themselves might conceal some lurking menace. Holmes remained silent, assume a sinister coherence. Holmes lost little time in arranging an interview with Andrew Mackinnon, the only son of the missing baronet's first marriage. We were informed beforehand that the young man bore a reputation for volatility, both in business and in society, and that his tongue was as sharp as his temper. It was with some anticipation, therefore, that I accompanied Holmes to the lodgings in Bloomsbury, where Andrew had lately taken rooms. The place was untidy and ill-kept. A curious contrast to the grandeur in which he might have lived had fortune favoured him more. At our knock he appeared almost instantly, a tall, spare figure with flushed cheeks and restless eyes. There was in his manner an air of smouldering resentment, as if the world had long conspired against him. Holmes's composure seemed only to heighten his nervous agitation, and I saw that this promised to be no quiet interview, but a stormy encounter. No sooner had the preliminary courtesies been exchanged than Andrew's bitterness found its outlet. He spoke with a vehemence that startled me, launching at once into denunciations of his stepmother. "That woman," he cried, pacing the floor, "has wormed her way into my father's affections and stolen what was mine by right. She is nothing but an adventuress, a schemer who preyed upon his weakness in his declining years. Do you think it accident that he vanished in her hour of triumph? No, sir. She contrived it, and she has the audacity now to play the grieving widow." His voice rose almost to a shout, and his hands clenched as though he would strike the air. It was plain that his hatred of Clara Mackinnon had become an obsession, feeding upon itself until it consumed all reason. Pressed by Holmes with calm inquiries, Andrew revealed the grounds of his fury. He declared that Sir Alister had resolved to alter his will in favour of Clara, disinheriting him almost entirely. The estate, the business interests, even the ancestral house in Ayrshire, were to pass into her hands. "Is it not enough," he demanded bitterly, "that she should rob me of my father's affection? Must she strip me too of my heritage? If he is gone, then her triumph is complete. But I tell you, gentlemen, I will see her exposed for what she is before I yield my birthright." The words came in torrents, half accusation, half despair, and left the impression of a man fighting desperately against the tide of events. As he raged, I could not help but observe the unguarded passion with which he spoke. His cheeks burned, his gestures were violent, and his words flowed with a heat that knew no restraint. Such untempered vehemence, I thought, might easily drive a man to some rash act, and I found myself wondering whether his anger had already betrayed him into darker deeds. I reflected that the very violence of his protest might in itself form a ground for suspicion. For what more natural than that an embittered son, disinherited by his father's second marriage, should seize a desperate opportunity to rid himself of both rival and injustice? I whispered something of this impression to Holmes, but he gave no sign of agreement. Throughout the young man's outburst, Holmes preserved his habitual reserve. Seated quietly, his long fingers steepled before him, he put questions with a courtesy so measured that it seemed to irritate Andrew the more. By degrees, however, those questions began to reveal small cracks in the edifice of the young man's assertions. Dates were confused, details uncertain, and more than once he contradicted himself in his eagerness to accuse. Holmes listened with polite attentiveness, noting each slip with the faintest movement of his brows, but offering no comment. The storm spent itself at last, leaving Andrew pale and exhausted, and grave facades seemed to mirror the weight of the affairs conducted within. Holmes had arranged an interview with Edmund Carrick, the solicitor long retained by Sir Arthur Mackinnon. The building into which we were admitted was a grey and narrow structure, its passages echoing faintly with the steps of clerks, its walls lined with shelves of dust-laden folios. There was in the very air a dryness, as if centuries of parchments had breathed it, and I confess that I felt instinctively oppressed by the austerity of the place. Holmes, on the other hand, moved with the easy assurance of one to whom such environments were merely another theatre in which truth might be compelled to reveal itself. We were shown into a chamber where Mr. Carrick awaited us. He was a man of middle years, his figure spare, his countenance smooth and carefully controlled. He rose with formal courtesy, and in his measured tones of welcome there was not a note of surprise. His manner was one of studied calm, yet beneath it I detected a guarded quality, as though he feared to betray more than he intended. He listened to Holmes's introduction with composed attention, his hands folded neatly upon the desk before him, and when he spoke of Sir Alister's disappearance, it was with expressions of regret so perfectly modulated that they conveyed little warmth. I was struck by the air of detachment in his words, as though his client's fate were less a personal tragedy than a professional inconvenience. At Holmes's request, Carrick produced several papers from a locked drawer, spreading them carefully upon the desk. They consisted of correspondence and contracts relating to a projected venture in South American railways, an undertaking of vast scope but uncertain security. The figures were formidable, the risks scarcely less so, and I could not but wonder that a man already so wealthy should hazard his fortune upon so speculative a scheme. Sir Alister, said Carrick with unruffled voice, was fully determined upon this enterprise. He had spoken of it to me repeatedly, and had instructed that measures be taken for the necessary. Holmes, who had followed the exposition with his customary attention, merely inclined his head. Indeed, said he, a bold speculation. And yet, I recall that Lady Mackinnon, if I may so term her, expressed no knowledge of such matters when questioned. For the first time, Carrick's composure seemed momentarily ruffled. Ladies, he returned smoothly, are seldom admitted to the intricacies of finance. I am not surprised that she should have been ignorant of the precise details. Holmes made no reply, but his keen eyes dwelt upon the solicitor's face with an intensity that seemed to strip away the layers of professional reserve. There was a pause in which I fancied the very ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece grew loud, before Carrick resumed his explanations in tones of renewed calm. For my own part, I could not shake a sense of unease. There was something in Carrick's clipped phrases, his steady but evasive gaze, which suggested that his apparent openness was in truth but a screen. I recalled the young widow's halting account of her husband's departure, so vague in its particulars, and compared it with the solicitor's confident recital of financial plans. The dissonance between the two accounts struck me forcibly, and I felt that somewhere in the space between them lay the concealed truth. More than once I caught myself watching Carrick's eyes as he turned from paper to paper. They were cold, calculating eyes. Yet now and again a shadow of apprehension flickered across them, as though he were conscious of scrutiny too penetrating to be ignored. When at last we took our leave, Carrick bowed us out with the same punctilious courtesy with which he had received us. On the pavement outside I turned to Holmes with a question upon my lips, but he forestalled it with a slight gesture of his hand. "There is, Watson," said he, "a precision which betrays more than it conceals. Our friend Carrick is exact in his figures, scrupulous in his forms, and yet he has said too much and not enough." Might take. His hand trembled slightly as he poured out glasses of sherry for us, and though he smiled readily, his eyes flickered anxiously from my companion to myself. At Holmes's request, he began to recount his recollections of the night in question. "It was near upon midnight," said he, "when I happened to be wakeful and strolled along the corridor for a breath of air. As I passed Sir Alister's compartment, I distinctly heard raised voices. The words were muffled, but the tones left no doubt of a heated quarrel. Sir Alister I recognised at once, for his accent was broad Scots, but the other, I could not place him. Their voices rose and fell with such vehemence that I paused, unwilling to intrude, yet unable to withdraw without some curiosity. From what little reached me, I gathered it was a matter of finance, for I heard mention of ruin, exposure, and such like terms. It seemed extraordinary that such a dispute should be carried on in the dead of night, and I confess, it gave me a certain uneasiness. He leaned back as he spoke, as if satisfied with the impression he had created. Pressed by Holmes to be precise, Vale went on to describe what followed. As I lingered there, the quarrel subsided suddenly, and I became aware of movement within. A moment later, the door opened softly, and a man stepped into the corridor. The passage was but dimly lit, and the blinds of Sir Alister's compartment were half drawn, so I saw little beyond the outline of a tall figure, wrapped in a dark cloak. He moved swiftly, avoiding my eye, and in another instant had vanished into the further shadows of the train. The whole incident was so abrupt that I scarce had time to collect myself. Yet I am prepared to swear that it was no dream nor illusion. A stranger visited Sir Alister that night, and if you ask me, gentlemen, I should say it bore all the appearance of a secret meeting with some hired villain. Holmes, who had listened in silence, now regarded the man with a steady gaze that seemed to probe beneath his words. For my own part, I could not but be impressed by the circumstantial detail of the account, and I felt a stir of unease at the suggestion of a mysterious visitor gliding unseen along the train. Yet something in Holmes's expression told me that his mind had already detected flaws which my own credulous ear had overlooked. As Vale concluded his account, I confess that I felt no small degree of conviction in his favour. The earnestness of his tone, the careful recollection of detail, and the very natural agitation he displayed seemed to me the marks of a truthful witness. His manner lacked the cold detachment of Carrick or the violent passion of young Mackinnon. Rather, it bore the stamp of a man anxious only to discharge his duty to justice. I found myself inwardly reproaching Holmes for his silence, and could not resist whispering that here, perhaps, we had discovered the first reliable clue to Sir Alister's fate. Vale, catching my sympathetic look, seemed encouraged, and launched again into his narrative with renewed fervour, as though eager to assure himself of our confidence. Holmes, however, now leaned forward, and in his quiet, deliberate way, began to put questions that at first appeared of the most innocent character. You say, Mr. Vale, that the quarrel occurred near midnight. At what point of the journey was the train then? Vale hesitated, then replied that they must have been north of Crewe. And yet, Holmes observed gently, the line between Crewe and Warrington is level and straight. Would you say the train ran smoothly or with jolting? The witness frowned, uncertain, before declaring that it had seemed rougher than usual. Strange, murmured Holmes, for the records show the permanent way there is in excellent repair. He passed lightly on, inquiring as to the quality of the lighting in the corridor, the precise manner in which the cloaked figure turned, and whether Sir Alister of its occurrence. Holmes's smile was faint, almost indulgent. My dear Watson, said he, our friend Vale has indeed given us a scene, so dramatic, so circumstantial, that it might have graced the stage of Drury Lane, but truth is seldom so artfully embroidered. Mark how he varied his hours, his descriptions, even his recollection of the voices. He has told us not what he saw, but what he would have us believe he saw. It is the embroidery, not the fabric, that betrays him. Depend upon it, his tale is one woven more of vanity than veracity. I protested that he spoke convincingly, but Holmes shook his head. A man may appear sincere, Watson, yet sincerity is but the varnish of his own self-deception. Let us place Mr. Vale's story upon the shelf with other curiosities, and await the sterner testimony of fact. When next I entered our sitting room at Baker Street, I found Holmes already engrossed in a litter of papers that covered the table in disordered profusion. Railway schedules lay open beside maps of the North-Western Line, while a small notebook of his own, crowded with minute figures, showed how earnestly he had been at work. He barely looked up at my arrival, but motioned me to a chair. Here, Watson, said he, we must replace rumour with certainty. The Glasgow Express is no phantom. It moves according to iron law. If we can but reconstruct its progress minute by minute, we may yet perceive the hidden hand that directed Sir Alister's fate. His long fingers traced the columns of departure and arrival, and I saw at once that his mind had seized upon the problem with that inexorable energy which never left it until the last detail had been mastered. Patiently, he began to march me through the night's journey, as though we ourselves had taken it anew. "We leave Euston at 8:15, he observed. "Reach Crewe at 10:50, Warrington at 11:15. By midnight we are well north of Preston, where the line enters its longer stretches and the night is at its deepest. Mark how the train passes through 2 brief tunnels here, and again further north between Carlisle and Lockerbie. The guard statements correspond, the times agree, and thus our intervals are fixed." He drew his pencil in sharp strokes across the map, as though pinning the truth to the paper. I confess that the relentless precision of it fascinated me, and I felt as though the very engine itself thundered once more in my ears. Holmes now leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Observe, Watson, what these figures teach us." The train was full. Every platform swarmed with eyes. No man could have alighted unmarked, least of all Sir Alister, the figure well known and easily recognized. To suppose he slipped away alone is folly. He was removed, and removed with aid so deliberate that it masked itself in impossibility. He spoke the words slowly, with the quiet triumph of one who sees the pattern hidden from others. I shivered at the thought, for the notion of a vanished man seemed less marvellous than the certainty that unseen hands had contrived his disappearance under cover of the very order that should have prevented it. Rising, Holmes laid his finger upon a particular stretch of the line. "Here, Watson. The tunnels of the North Road, darkness without, smoke within. The roar of the train blotting out every cry. Here is the only stage upon which such a drama could be played. Elsewhere, the lights of stations or the open country would betray the act. Here the night itself becomes an accomplice." I bent over the map, and as I did so, I could almost feel the press of black air, the choking soot, the sense of menace that those narrow, merciless silence. The horror of it sent a chill through my very blood. "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed. "It is monstrous, monstrous beyond belief." He turned to me gravely. "Yes, Watson, but it is only by facing the monstrous that we may drag it into light. And until we do so, Sir Alister's vanishing will remain but a spectre haunting the Glasgow Express." Our arrival in Glasgow was marked by a gloom which seemed to hang over the entire city. A pall of smoke drifted above the tall chimneys, spreading a dusky veil across the sky, while the air itself bore that acrid tang which speaks of furnace and forge. The Clyde rolled sluggishly beneath its bridges, its surface stained with the industry of countless works that lined its banks. To my southern eyes, the place seemed stern, unbending, a city built more for labour than for grace, and I felt anew the gravity of the task which had brought us there. Holmes, however, walked with quick, absorbed steps, his keen gaze indifferent to the grime and bustle about him, intent only upon the pursuit of fact. That day and the next we spent in patient inquiry among the houses of commerce with whom Sir Alister had been associated. Holmes, by his extraordinary art of drawing men into talk while himself saying little, soon had a number of clerks and agents volunteering details they might otherwise have withheld. Bit by bit, a picture emerged of a man deeply entangled in ventures of no ordinary risk. "He was bold, too bold," muttered one merchant, shaking his head. Another spoke of contracts signed with little caution, and undertakings pledged upon the most uncertain securities. Everywhere the tale was the same. Sir Alister had launched himself upon enterprises whose magnitude was equalled only by their hazard. I confess that as I listened, I marvelled less at his disappearance than that he had not long since been overwhelmed by ruin.
Yet among all these accounts, one name recurred with ominous frequency, that of Edmund Carrick. In London, he had appeared the model of probity, the grave adviser who clothed every statement in legal caution. But here, in the harsh light of Glasgow, whispers abounded of another sort. More than one clerk hinted that Carrick had diverted funds for his own use. Others spoke of accounts left unexplained, of sums advanced and never repaid. "It was Sir Alister who kept him upright," said one, lowering his voice. "The old man knew, aye, he knew, but whether from loyalty or from fear of scandal, he let it lie. Had it come to light, Carrick would have been ruined." I saw Holmes's lips tighten as he heard these words, though he made no comment. But I knew from the gleam in his eye that he had marked the shadow falling ever darker across the figure of the solicitor. It was on the third morning of our stay that Holmes placed before me a bundle of papers, obtained by means best known to himself, though I gathered they came through discreet access to the ledgers of one of Carrick's firms. "Here, Watson," said he, "we have the naked figures which men may twist with their tongues but cannot efface from their books." Together we bent over the columns, and even my untrained eye could perceive the irregularities that cried out from the page. Large sums had been drawn ostensibly for the purposes of investment, yet never replaced, and more than one entry bore the signature of Carrick where no authority had been granted. "It is embezzlement, plain and simple," Holmes murmured, his finger tapping the damning lines. Sir Alister, with his keen sense for finance, could not fail to detect it. Had he lived but a few weeks longer, Carrick would have stood disgraced, ruined, perhaps imprisoned. Need I say more? The man had every motive which desperation can supply. His voice, though low, carried the chill of certainty, and I felt that the shadow of guilt lay heavier than ever upon the London solicitor. Yet, as our investigation in the smoky outskirts of the city, I ventured to ask Holmes whether he now considered the mystery solved. He shook his head gravely. "The motive is clear enough, Watson. Carrick stood upon the brink of exposure and had all to lose. But motive alone is but the shadow of proof, and as for the widow, I cannot yet tell whether she is the shield that protected him or the sword that struck with him. The facts admit of both readings, and until further evidence tips the scale, we must keep our minds open. Remember, it is often the ambiguity of human hearts that most clouds the lens of justice." He turned back to his notes, leaving me to reflect with a heavy heart upon the tragic tangle of greed, loyalty, and deceit into which the disappearance of Sir Alister Mackinnon had plunged us. Holmes wasted no time upon our return to London. That same evening he drafted 2 short notes, which he dispatched by special messenger, one to Clara Mackinnon, the other to Edmund Carrick. Their contents he did not reveal, but I gathered from his expression that he had contrived to bring both to Baker Street at the same hour. "We must," he said, "place our birds within the same cage, Watson." The truth seldom withstands the presence of its accomplices. Though I felt a twinge of unease at the boldness of the manoeuvre, I could not deny the confidence with which he set about his design. The following afternoon, as we awaited our guests, Holmes busied himself with small adjustments to the sitting room, arranging chairs and tables with a care that seemed almost whimsical. Yet I perceived that every detail was intended to produce its effect. The positioning of light, the angle of chairs, even the distance between them. He moved with studied casualness, yet the air in the room grew heavy with expectancy, as though the very walls anticipated the clash to come. I found myself restless, pacing to the window and back, while Holmes, stretched at length upon the sofa, smoked with an appearance of indifference, which I knew to be but the mask of... Carrick was the first to arrive. He entered with the air of a man resolved to bear himself well under scrutiny, his manner outwardly courteous yet tinged with a stiffness that betrayed inward disquiet. He greeted us with punctilious civility, speaking in smooth tones of regret that circumstances should require his presence.
But beneath the veneer of composure, I detected an uneasiness which no art could wholly conceal. Holmes returned his salutations with polite brevity, his keen eyes resting upon the solicitor's face in a gaze so searching that Carrick shifted in his seat as though beneath a physical weight. It was but a short interval before Clara Mackinnon was shown in. She came clad in mourning black, her figure slight, her veil drawn but not enough to hide the pallor of her features. There was in her bearing a fragility that spoke of a mind torn between conflicting impulses, loyalty, fear, and a grief too real to be wholly feigned. She inclined her head in greeting, her eyes avoiding Carrick's, and I saw her hands tremble as she clasped them together. To me, she seemed less a conspirator than a woman crushed by circumstances beyond her strength. Yet Holmes's face betrayed no such sentiment, as he bade her be seated opposite the solicitor. The examination began with Holmes's characteristic quietness. He did not thunder accusations, but rather posed questions so mild that they might have seemed trivial. Yet each bore within it a barb. He asked Carrick to repeat the nature of Sir Alistair's intended investments. Then, turning to Clara, inquired what her husband had spoken of on his last evening. The answers, though plausible in themselves, soon began to jar when set side by side. Dates were confused, motives misrepresented, and once, when Carrick declared Sir Alistair had left behind no papers of importance, Holmes produced from his desk a document which Clara had earlier mentioned to us. At each new inconsistency, Holmes merely raised his brows, or uttered a soft, "Indeed." Deceit. He turned to Carrick, whose silence was that of a man who sees the last prop of his defence collapse. For myself, I could scarcely look upon the weeping widow without pity, despite her avowal of complicity. Yet I knew that Holmes's net had closed, and that the mystery of Sir Alistair's vanishing was no longer beyond the reach of justice. The confession once spoken, a strange hush seemed to fall upon our rooms in Baker Street. Clara Mackinnon sat bowed, her face hidden in her hands, while Carrick, white and rigid, remained mute in his chair. Holmes, grave and silent, had taken his place by the hearth, and for a time none of us stirred. The very ticking of the clock sounded loud in the stillness, and I could feel the weight of tragedy pressing upon the familiar walls. It was in this atmosphere of subdued solemnity that I saw most clearly the contrast between Holmes's calm detachment and the broken emotions of those before him. At length, Holmes spoke, his voice low but steady. He began to trace in measured words the path by which his reasoning had travelled. The locked door, which had seemed an insoluble riddle, was explained. Once soot upon the sill and scratches upon the window frame revealed that the exit had not been by the door at all. The torn timetable, so lightly dismissed by others, had shown the precise moments when concealment was possible. The abandoned cigar spoke of an interruption, sudden and unwelcome. Piece by piece he laid out the chain, each link fastening the next with such clarity that I marvelled it had not been apparent to all. Thus, he concluded, we perceive that Sir Alistair was forced from his carriage in the darkness of the tunnel, the illusion of impossibility serving but to mask the very simplicity of the crime. He turned then to the conflicting testimonies which had sought to cloud the truth. Clara's faltering account, Carrick's polished evasions, Vale's florid invention, all, Holmes declared, had betrayed themselves by their very discordance. Each, said he, sought to mould the facts to his or her own necessity. But when testimonies clash, it is in their fractures that the truth emerges. The cracks in Carrick's precision, the widow's silences, the traveller's embellishments, they together formed a pattern more reliable than their words. Thus we passed from a web of lies to the solid framework of reality. Clara, raising her face, spoke then with a voice trembling between anguish and release. She confessed fully that she had not lifted a hand against her husband, but had allowed Carrick to act, silencing her conscience with the thought that cruelty deserved its own reward. Her words came in broken sentences, mingling sorrow with a strange relief, as though long-born guilt had at last found voice. I could not withhold my compassion, for though she stood self-condemned, her grief was of a nature too human to be denied. Holmes, however, remained unmoved by her tears. His gaze rested upon her with a severity touched by pity, and he said at last, "Madam, justice will pursue its appointed course, but mercy may yet find its way where law cannot tread. The world believes in punishment, yet there exists another reckoning, not of courts, but of conscience. Remember, it is often the heavier burden." He fell silent, and I saw in his eyes that inward light which shone whenever he looked beyond the immediate problem to the larger truths of life. Thus ended our inquiry into the vanishing of Sir Alister Mackinnon. The law, as Holmes had predicted, pursued its path, but for me the deeper impression was left by his words that evening, that justice and mercy, like the rails of the very train upon which the crime was wrought, run side by side,